Thank you very much. Good evening to you from Glenn and I. I've just cycled over from the Wallace, and it's quite a treacherous journey, but I'm delighted to be here. And I think this is definitely a very beautifully installed exhibition, and the lighting is extraordinary as well on the works. And we met for the first time at the Wallace Collection. It was your banquet that the Gagosian very kindly sponsored at the Wallace. And we hadn't met before, and I felt that we should have done, but it was a great honor to meet you. And we had a wonderful conversation, so I think hopefully we can reenact that conversation we had over dinner.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
I think my first question really is, as somebody who's worked with the old masters, from Ribera to Velázquez to El Greco, when I walk around here, straight away I see these connections. But I see an artist who's looked very hard, who's got very gifted in draftsmanship, but is able to also do something very different. And I just wanted to, I suppose, to get things started, and it's the obvious question, isn't it? What is your relationship with the old masters?
To a large extent, I suppose it's an act of homage, what I'm doing. I'm trying to say to a contemporary audience, look at what's around you, look at this fantastic history we have, 400-500 years of art, and there's so much of it to see in London or any great city you go to in the world, but a lot of people don't look. And to me, being in a museum is one of the most comfortable places for me to be. It was I think at the speech after the dinner in the Wallace Collection, I said that my ideal place to live would be a museum that was made up out of sort of all the different museums within London, and it's just being surrounded by history. It's like time travel. That's why I like a museum. It is the closest you can get to time travel, because especially with a painting or something as refined as a drawing, you really feel that you're having a connection with, that sounds rather cheesy to say, connection with the artist of the past, but you can see the way their musculature, their hand worked, and that relationship to their brain controlling their hand. And what fascinates me particularly about drawing is that it seems it's a language of its own. It's very peculiar to each. The handwriting almost of each artist is so very personal. And even though I borrow images from other artists and borrow subjects and even borrow styles from other artists, hopefully in the end my work has a particular style and look of its own, and it has a personality which is mine.
But do you go, when you walk into, say, the National Gallery or the Wallace, do you go for a composition from afar, or do you go for the stylistic qualities? Is it the painterly that attracts you, or is it the actual sort of composition, particularly, say, for that wonderful composition you have after an Italian Roman artist? You said it was Mancini. I tried to make the attribution, and I got it wrong, I have to admit. But, it's a good sort of Saint Ignatius or some kind of saint having a mystic moment with the Virgin Child. Was that what attracted you to it, or was it just the technique and the style?
It's to some extent it's not the subject matter, though I can't claim that the subject matter is not important, of course, but it's the style of the painting. It's the brushstrokes particularly that fascinate me. I mean, if you look at a Rembrandt painting, it can be a portrait, and yes, you have an engaging character that's sitting in front of you, but fundamentally you are sort of looking at the brushstrokes, and it's that sense of animation that the brushstrokes give a work, and it's the way that the character looks like they're breathing, because literally you feel each line on there, and sometimes the lines contradict the lines that might actually occur in a face, and they start to look like the musculature underneath the skin. That always fascinates me, as if you're looking through the skin, into the musculature, into the bone underneath, and you're really seeing into the mind of the sitter, as well as looking into the mind of the artist who painted the person. And it's that sense of objects being not solid anymore, they're being slightly gaseous, slightly covered in a membrane of oil paint, which fascinates me. Again, particularly with Rembrandt, where all of it, he loves this translucent surface.
No, so I would say you're attracted to the painterly painters. I mean, if somebody like, say, Bronzino, very highly polished, or Ingres, do they excite you as much as, say, Velasquez or Rembrandt, as you said, or Murillo? Do you have a sort of dislikes for the old masters from that point of view, or is it?
It's the individual character that each artist brings to it. I mean, there's sort of if you look at the Ingres painting and in the National Gallery at the moment in the Monochrome show, there's sort of just the beauty and the sheer delight with the way the skin is painted in this peculiar grey is. You don't need brushstrokes in that. It's not about that kind of energy. It's about a very different kind of energy that comes with just this sexy smoothness, which I hopefully try and include in the paintings as well. I mean, you need, I think a painting to tell an interesting visual story needs different sort of brushstrokes within it. It needs smooth and it needs rough, it needs quick and it needs slow. And it's just, as your eye moves across the surface of a painting, it should be confronted with different textures. I think that's very important. It just it excites you. Well, it excites me anyway.
No, I mean, one thing that I particularly appreciate coming into this show is this the fact that you've installed some of your sculptures. I don't know if you've made sculptures before, if this is a recent thing, but I think it's a very interesting way of bringing out that sort of sense of texture in a three-dimensional form. I mean, for me, these are almost like brushworks, but turned into a three-dimensional form. And next door, we were commenting on how one of your sculptures connects very well with some of the paintings, and you were explaining that you did a last-minute sort of touch to the sculpture to bring it back into context with the works hanging on the walls. Is that right?
Yes, the painting, the sculpture behind here called Sepulchre Culture, the standing figure in the room. We put it in. It wasn't originally meant to go in this room. And it wasn't quite working with the quite highly coloured paintings, the portraits that are in there, and it just needed to compete a little bit better. So I brought my paints in and was just touching up, and there's some green highlights, green slightly blue parts of it, which I added to it just so it sort of pinged with the paintings. It was very important to me that the paintings and the sculptures and the drawings converse with each other, and you can start to see narratives sort of as they jump off. And even if the narrative is not a literal narrative, it's just a narrative of maybe a line or a colour which interacts with the paintings and sculptures. Yeah.
But would you say, as a collector, of your work, would you insist that I also buy the sculpture to go with the painting, or can they live without each other? That's what it's always very interesting seeing work that a collector puts with how they combine things together. And even to a funny extent, it sounds an awful thing to say how they combine fabrics with the painting. Even the adage of we bought it because it went with the sofa. Well, don't hang a painting behind the sofa if it really doesn't go with it. A painting should be part of an environment, and the things that start arguing with each other and sort of cancelling each other out doesn't help anybody. So I don't want to be, I'm not trying to sort of be an interior designer, but sort of we did design this space. I mean, the colour in the walls is the same paint that they use in the Rijksmuseum. And I think people have subliminally picked it up as well. They've walked in and sort of had slightly Dutch feelings about it. And so and we've changed the walls, we changed the architecture and shape of the openings, because this Caruso St. John, the architect's like square, which I'm not quite so, well, I like their architecture very much, but in terms of the work in this exhibition, I thought something which was slightly more neoclassical was going to work. So the sort of the vertical was going to be more interesting. So we changed the opening sizes all over the exhibition to have this verticality rather than square openings. So even changing the architecture sort of came into sort of putting the exhibition together. I'm slightly obsessive and like to take control, I suppose. Well, I was going to ask you, who installed the show? It was you, by the sounds of it.
Yes, we had Gagosian over a year ago gave us a model of the space.
So you had a good... Okay.
And we were sort of changing the walls, changing the little cutout works we had, changing the colour on it. It got repainted quite a few times before we were happy with it. Yes, we fussed endlessly over the arrangement of rooms and the colours and where each work was supposed to go.
And one thing I noticed, especially coming from the Wallace, is how you frame your pictures. I was quite intrigued by the fact that you vary from very simple black frames that really bring out the composition, and sometimes you like to create a much more intimate atmosphere around some of your drawings especially, and have these rather Baroque frames. They remind me of the Pitti Palace frames that you see in Florence, these very over-the-top, very highly gilded and scarved Baroque frames. So, most people would shy away in terms of showing contemporary art in such frames, but you seem to really just go for it completely, and which is very, very pleasing to see.
Well, until a year ago, I would have shied away from it myself as well, but I was asked to do an exhibition in the Museo Stefano Bardini in Florence. And they have a wonderful collection of Renaissance frames, mostly gilt, but not always. And so they have this whole wall, well, 2 walls actually, hung with these gilt frames with nothing inside them. Sometimes it's a frame within a frame within a frame hung. And they suggested, or I can't remember who suggested, that I make some drawings for some of the frames. So I tried to fill nearly every frame on this wall with drawings. So I made drawings specifically for the frames, which in the case of some of them was a real challenge because they were Florentine frames, very florid, and a lot of movement in them. And you really have to change the character of the drawing in order to suit the frame. So the starting point for a lot of the drawings in this exhibition is the frame, and I love the idea of just turning that idea on its head, that you're not finding a frame or making a frame for the drawing, or rather for the painting. Obviously, most of these frames would have had paintings in originally,
or even mirrors, actually. Interestingly,
I think most of them you can kind of tell whether it was a frame made for a mirror or not. I've now become a little bit of an expert on frames, having travelled through Italy, finding frames and finding the difference between Roman frames, Bolognese frames, Genoese frames, and just the difference of character from different regions and over which periods they were from is fascinating, because
and it's as if you're turning into a connoisseur painter, somebody who is able to discern, and presumably when you go to a place like Nashgara, you can probably get quite excited about the wonderful frames.
Well, you can get slightly critical as well, sort of like, because a lot of museums have changed the frames that the artworks were originally in. Some of a lot of the frames in the Wallace Collection were sort of obviously changed in the 19th century by the look of them. And whether they fit the work as well as they could is slightly questionable.
No, it's an interesting thing you say. I mean, it's true that in the 19th century they wanted to make the collection look sort of homogeneous, and the frame was the first thing to do to make the pictures fit all together. And interestingly, in the 60s, 70s, particularly for the key pictures like the Frans Hals or the Rembrandts, they were put back into supposed Dutch frames. Of course, they're fake because the originals are very expensive, but it does mean that now the frames vary in terms of the 19th century French Regency frame versus the more sort of original 17th century frames. But it does have an extraordinary effect. I mean, the Rembrandts, we have this wonderful portrait of Titus, which I see you haven't yet tackled in your art in terms of adopting him and perhaps putting a red nose on him. But the Titus Rembrandt has got this beautiful Dutch frame that brings out all the colour schemes that Rembrandt sort of introduces, particularly those browns and those sort of dark colours. But you use them mainly for drawings, though. These frames, is that?
I haven't used any on paintings as yet. It's partially. I mean, the drawings are very graphic. I don't use any shading in them, and there's no pencil in any of it. Well, very little pencil anyway.
There's no preparation underneath. What you draw is directly onto the.
There's some if I draw in pencil, it gets rubbed out.
Okay.
So it's if there is preparation that goes on underneath, then it's not really meant to be seen. I'm trying to produce this very graphic, iconographic sort of image that's meant to be quite clean.
Right.
They're not really meant to look like working drawings. They really are made as sort of finished works in their own right. In some sense, with the paintings, they're all about brushstrokes. They're taking the brushstrokes of the original artist and then sort of flattening them out, obviously, and making them more highlighted, sort of increasing these long lines of sort of black and white, and sort of as the light reflects on this sort of glistening paint. And just as a lot of my paintings, or nearly all of my paintings from the last 20 years have been about the brushstroke, I was trying to create drawings which are very much about the line, and how the line becomes a very graphic element, and how it almost becomes a subject in itself in a lot of drawings. And that sense of storytelling that a line can have, as literally you take the line for a walk over the surface. And so I set myself a task of making drawings that used no shading. All the shading had to be created just from line.
The sort of contrast between one line and the other, is that what you mean? The sort
Yes.
of vibration you get by placing one line next to the other.
Vibration is a very good way of putting it. It's sort of, as soon as you get, if you get two lines crossing over each other, you get a sort of clash and sort of sense, this interesting sense of movement.
No, because some of your drawings sometimes remind me of Dürer, and sometimes even woodcuts. There's something, different kinds of woodcuts that you superimpose, and you get the white and the black on top of each other. And particularly the way you zoom in, they tend to be portrait heads, and sometimes sort of slightly foreshortened. And it's in terms of getting those foreshortenings, where do they come from? Is that from your mind as you're drawing, or is it because you're looking at examples from the past that you readapt?
I'm adapting. I'm a sort of the computer is quite important in Photoshop. Actually, it has lots of interesting things you can do with it. So very often I will take the original image, I will put it in Photoshop, and I will play around with it, stretching, pulling, and then drawing on top of it in Photoshop. And using, so often that sort of closed-in effect is sort of sometimes done on Photoshop before I start the drawing. I think that artists like Rembrandt and Gagosian and Frans Hals would have loved Photoshop. They wouldn't have been able to have. Why would you not use these tools if they were there? They encourage you to do peculiar things, and it was just silly to say no to them. So yes, even though none of these things are printed, they're all hand drawn, and most of it is me just making the line up, and as I go along, very often the starting point is a sort of is something that comes out of a computer.
I mean, one thing I used to love doing as a student was go to the British Museum and look at drawings and get very close to them, but then start seeing how an artist changes his mind in terms of the position of the head. And actually, there's that wonderful drawing after Murillo, Assumption of the Virgin. And if you look really carefully, you see her looking down, and then you see her looking up. Was that you making that change, or was it because you saw something, two Immaculate Conceptions by Murillo that you superimposed? How did that come about?
They're two superimposed one over the other,
right?
And then there's a lot of further redrawing, and then further sort of colour was added on top of it. So you get this sort of mass of cherubs underneath that you see cherub-like shapes, but nothing and you can quite put your finger on is saying that absolutely looks like a cherub. You get this little arm sticking out now and again, and yes, so it's layering one on top of each other, and then a lot of freehand drawing on top of that.
Right. No, because as art historians, they get very excited by the process, the idea of being with the artist as he makes those changes or she makes those changes, and seeing something develop. And one gets that from your drawings as a sense of working things through. But actually, the more you talk about it, it's something that you've planned very carefully and meticulously.
I never really. 50% of it is planned, and then 50% of it is just me making it up afterwards. So it's if I pre-plan, there's one or two drawings that are probably about 70% planned. Most of them it probably is an awful lot of what you're seeing. I didn't know it was going to be there, and sometimes a whole different element will get added at the last stages that I didn't know was going to be there. So I think I'm always so desperate to get a drawing to work, because usually I get halfway through and thinking, this isn't quite as interesting as it should be. So I'll go hunting for other elements to start bringing in to sort of add to something. I'll borrow little techniques from anything that I can think of in order to get a drawing to be more exciting. So I'm borrowing from
And I
everything.
suppose, I mean, a question that it might be a slightly tedious question, but would you consider yourself an academic artist, an artist who's gone through art school and trained as in very serious-minded, very assiduous, or would you say that that's the sort of academic side of your painting, which is actually sometimes very anti-academic? Is that something that you're working to do, or is it something that's inside you? I don't know. I mean, it's in terms of your training, what are the roots of your art?
I suppose the sort of in terms of my training, if the word academic was always rather a dirty word, if you were called academic, you were you'd failed in something. It lacked sincerity or it lacked emotion. You kind of realise that that's a bit preposterous, really. My starting point is I went to Bath. I went to the Norwich School of Art, where we were, John Lassaw was head of the life drawing class there, and it was very drawing plaster casts and drawing from the model. And even before I went to art college, when I was sort of 14 and 15, I would go and do life drawing. I was quite obsessive about it when I was younger. And then I went to Bath College of Art, where it was more to do with abstraction and nature. And then I went to Goldsmiths, which was to do with philosophy and cultural studies. But the idea that somebody was going to academically tell you that you should have a little bit more green here and the composition would be better if you had sort of some darker areas here or a line across here, that was never going to happen at Goldsmiths. You weren't going to be told about how to make a good academic composition. So I kind of passed through the whole gamut of sort of education in terms of the visual arts. And I suppose came out of an education system far more conceptual in nature as a painter. Sort of Gerhard Richter was probably one of my biggest influences, and he's an artist who doesn't draw at all. He doesn't need to because it's based on photography, and the photographic printed image is far more, or an artist like Sigmar Polke, again, very much to do with the printed image or the photograph. And it's only it's sort of slowly over the past 25 years, I suppose, or 20 years, that sort of I've been sort of drifting back into a far more academic way, where no, you can't tell a good story unless you learn the language of how to make a good composition, how to create depth, how to use colour properly. What happens when I used to have a professor at college that would say a painting is all about lines. He obsessed with Matisse, and if you look at Matisse's paintings, it's not lines, sorry, edges. The painting is made of edges. It's just colours or tones meet each other in different ways. You can have a soft edge, a jagged edge, a sharp edge, a sort of fluffy edge, so that one colour can come over the top of the other. And if you look at Matisse paintings specifically, they really are all about edges with just flat bits in between them. These are things you kind of academically have to learn, and you have to be taught. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say is I like conceptual art, but I like the sort of concept of appropriation, but fundamentally it wasn't enough for me in the end. I had to learn how to paint as well.
No, I mean, it's very interesting to hear the way you explain that, and particularly when you consider those wonderful nudes that are in this exhibition. They're grand paintings. They very likely hold their own if you inserted them at the National Gallery or even the Wallace. It'd be very, you might want to do it one day. But it's interesting the space you create around them, also the sort of vacuum around them, and of course you decapitate quite a few of your large nudes. What's with this decapitation? Is that a way of introducing a sense of violence to the picture, a sense of a narrative perhaps, or something psychological perhaps? I don't know.
Am I psychologically disturbed? Well, probably. It's trying to create something which is grotesque. I mean, it's so much of the art of the past. Only after hanging this exhibition did I realise quite how grotesque and how depressing the whole thing was, and how apt that these very dark walls were. There's not an awful lot of laughs in this exhibition. It's macabre, and there's sort of death sort of mentioned an awful lot of times in the titles and the subject matter, and a lot of the portraits appear to be of people that are half dead. So the idea of decapitating a figure seems almost quite natural within this sort of rather macabre scenario. But if you look at the art of so many artists that I like very much, you find similar themes. If you look at Goya, there's not an awful lot of that's funny in Goya. There's extremely dark. Well, it's a black sense of humour, if you see a sense of humour. If you look at Velasquez, there's a darkness in there. But so if you look at Rembrandt as well, he's trying to get to something which is not light. It's a very our mortality is written large in a lot of works that I love so much. So I don't really apologise for being rather repugnant in terms of my subject matter. But a lot of what I think how the Decapitation started out was that I was looking, in a lot of the portraits I make, I take the eyes out or I cloud the eyes over, which is a way, it's a trick that Matisse, Cézanne, Modigliani, Picasso would use, where you take the eyes out of the subject. So it's a way of saying, don't look at the subject, don't have a conversation with the person that's been painted. Have a conversation with me, the artist, especially Picasso. Picasso is far more important than Marie-Thérèse, whoever he was painting, Dora Maar, whichever subject was being painted. Picasso wanted you to look at him and how clever he was. So it's just a way of saying, don't look at them as don't look at the person as being a particular person. Look at the way it's painted, and taking the eyes out, and taking the head off is just taking it that step further, where you really can have no conversation with the person here. You really are looking at just a body and the way it's painted, and it becomes far more abstract to that level.
I mean, you mentioned grotesque. I suppose you want to shock, you want to wake people up as they look at your pictures. What about narrative? Is there a sense of narrative? I mean, there's a narrative in the compositions that you borrow, and I mean, this one is like a sort of apotheosis of some kind of saint or king. I don't know if it's based on Tiepolo but there's something very sort of like those great ceiling paintings you see in Venice. But in maybe the sort of more individualized compositions, do you try and introduce a narrative around your pictures, or do you expect the people to sort of think up a narrative?
I'm to some extent, I'm trying to create a narrative, but it's more a narrative that's visual, that's about the way your eye moves around the surface of the painting, and moves in and out of the painting as well. So I'm not really expecting somebody to know which particular saint is being taken up to heaven and why they're having a meeting with their maker. I want your eye to move over the surface and be sort of entertained by the lines and the flow and the Baroque movement that's in the work. But yes, sort of, I mean, the way the sort of like the colour has a sort of story within it as well. What does it remind you of? Does it remind you of rotting flesh? Does it remind you of fresh flowers? Is it beautiful? Is it repugnant? And I want there to be a narrative that's somehow more abstract. As well as a sort of more obvious. I mean, very often the sort of titles may lead you to a sort of slightly odd sort of narrative happening within a work that you sort of think. So many people have come up to me and said, your titles, that sort of, am I meant to be just confused by everything? And no, you just have to be a little bit more poetic in your sort of your reading of the title, I think would be my interpretation. And there's a painting over there called Die Mutter der Künstlers, the artist's mother. And it's one of the headless figures, and it's Christ. And somebody was standing next to me at the opening and said, what does that title have to do with the figure? I mean, have to do with this painting? And I thought, well, it's the artist's mother. She has stigmata in her hands and feet. She has a wound in her side, which she's just dipped her finger in, and she's holding it out accusingly to you. It's this is another sort of interesting, peculiar narrative that you can see within that, and sort of, yes, but sort of you just have to sort of read it in a little more complex and poetic way, I think, in order to get the narratives out of the paintings. They're not meant to be too obvious.
And I mean, there's that still life, which I like to go back to look at it. But there's a sort of sense of not decadence, but something sort of rotting, and it's not the still life that brings a sense of wanting to, you know, pick the flower or pick the fruit, or it's there's a sense of decay in it. Is that a way of looking at that picture, or of sense of transience of life, I suppose? Would you say that could be?
It's a drawing that's the starting point was a painting I made based on a Bernardo Strozzi painting. The painting I made, the first one, is very, very large painting. And then I made this drawing. It was specifically made to go above a fireplace in a house we have. It's an early 18th century house, and it would be in the panelling as a painting. And then painting was missing, so that painting was made specifically to go in a specific environment. But yes, the flowers are at their most beautiful just at the point in which they start to die. The colour and the scent and the fluidity of the flower, if there's such a word as fluidity, is just at their most wonderful, just as the petals are going to start to drop. And it's one of the sort of wonderful thing about cut flowers. I always think that they, in order to cut them and appreciate them in the house, you have to kill them. The seeds aren't going to turn into little seed pods and grow again next year. You're stopping that whole thing. You're killing them for your pleasure, for your own pleasure. So there's a sort of cruel enjoyment in cut flowers. And these particular cut flowers, they've been made much more horizontal and flattened out from the original, as if they're sort of really compressing themselves towards the ground, whilst I've introduced these sort of floating, you're not quite sure whether it's smoke or whether it's scent rising from them, as if in their point of composition they're turning to gas and rising up to heaven, both rotting and being rising up at the same time.
And you mentioned Monochrome. We have one of the curators present here at the next National Gallery exhibition, which actually has just closed, I think. But there's these grisailles, these monochrome pictures that you paint. Is that because you want to take colour out of the composition, or is it because you're interested in the contrast between light and dark? I mean, I'm particularly thinking of the Mancini painting here.
Well, I was very aware of the sort of wonderful history of monochrome painting, and I sort of love the way in a lot of monochrome oil paintings, they're never quite black and white, because the nature of oil paint is that it never wants to go on and stay. When you glaze one colour over another, you can get warm or cold effects. And so even though they're monochrome, actually you get warm and cold areas within it, and you control that, even though they're just made with two colour paints, a black paint and a white paint. There were slight variances in them. But it was partially the sort of rich history of the idea of the monochrome or the grisaille, but also the idea that a lot of my paintings are very colourful. The colour is sort of is heightened as much as I can heighten it, and to the point of being grotesque and rather repugnant. And when you do one thing to the extreme, you want to do it the other way to the extreme, so you take all the colour out. And it's a lot of the paintings are just exercises and have me having fun in my studio, and can I get this to work or not? If I take all the colour out of it, can I still make the composition work? And you play around with the idea of them being, is it a drawing or is it a painting? Well, it doesn't, is it a sculpture or is it a painting? I like things sort of crossing over between different media. So I haven't made very many grisaille paintings. It's not something I've done sort of natural in doing, but they were further planned.
I mean, you talk about repugnant quite you mentioned the word repugnant a lot of times. I work in the collection, which is celebrated especially for the 18th century French Rococo, which a lot of people nowadays find very difficult to swallow. They find it kitsch, over the top, too colourful, too emotional. We have these wonderful paintings by Greuze of these ladies looking up into the sky, looking a bit sort of, feeble and sort of away with the pixies. And then we've got Fragonard, the swing, and we've got these beautifully painted paintings by Fragonard, but they are not people's taste really at this moment in time. Would you say that because your work has got these incredible heightened colours and this sort of slightly over the top Baroque approach, would you say that your pictures are part of today's taste, or is it something that you care about and that you just forget about taste and just paint away as in your studio and have fun, as you say?
I think taste is very much part of it, but I think taste is also a sort of political act in some ways as well. That the Rococo does go very against contemporary ideas of what is tasteful, and artists like the Bouchers that you have. People obviously find them very hard to look at, but what I'm trying to do is say, don't necessarily look at the subject matter, but look at the way it's painted. Look at Boucher's brushstrokes within these paintings and how elegant they are, and what he's trying to say. I'm very interested in mannerism and the idea that it was almost an opposition to classicism. My sort of opinion was that sort of classicism was very interesting in the sort of retelling of Roman and Greek sensibilities, not just sort of their visual understanding of the world, but also their political understanding of the world. And the Baroque was a sort of an idea, the Baroque and mannerism was a way of saying, actually, the neoclassicism isn't quite as, which was to do with sort of man's dominance over nature. The Baroque was doing, actually, well, nature can start fighting back again, and the idea of the curling mark, the sort of thing being unbalanced, things falling down, and the rigidity of neoclassicism is taken over by the sort of more naturalistic flowing marks of the Baroque, which lead into Rococo. And I think for the 21st century, that's having great difficulty, and the way that neoclassicism sort of smoothly moves, well, not that smoothly, sort of moves into modernism. It seems very interesting because, again, modernism is about this male rigidity. It's about dominance over nature, that we will sort of concrete over the world. We will create structures which have nothing to do with nature. They're about cubes and lines, things you don't find in nature, rather than the sort of the Baroque flowing lines. And so I think, well, we can't, we're ruining the world. We can't continue to dominate nature anymore. We're creating plastics, we're creating cityscapes which are destroying nature, and we'll destroy our own sense of self in the process. So I think actually the Baroque and the Rococo as well have an awful lot to say for our present age, because it's like, no, we need to look at nature. We need to consider the fact that sort of the fluidity of nature needs to come back into our lives. We need to have a greater understanding that we can't dominate all the time. We have to sort of give in to these beautiful flowing marks of Boucher, and that we are made, the way he paints a tree or fish or the sea, and that the sort of strange sea creatures that come out of the sea and that form into mermaids, and that we are part of nature and nature is part of us. And I think he's trying to tell us that. He's trying to tell us to be more environmentally friendly. It sounds a really trashy way of putting it, but there's a truth there, and I think that we need to look at artists like Boucher and consider a different sensibility, a different sort of sense of domination, and maybe a more feminine understanding of our understanding towards the world as well.
No, it's true that, I mean, when I try and convince people to not only just come to the Wallace, but to appreciate the great French 18th century collection, I tell them that it's not just about looking at Boucher, but also looking at the frames, as you've done, but also the furniture, the porcelain, the mounted, the gilt mounts that are used to make these beautiful objects even more beautiful, because they like to, with export Chinese porcelain, for example, they create these gilt mounts that, you know, a bit like your sculptures, they almost melt before you, and you have to take it all as one and just almost just relax and enjoy this sensory moment. It's all about the senses in the end, and connecting. I think you're right. I mean, nature is the sort of root for it, but it's the way that nature's manipulated and turned into these splendid forms.
Oh, it's a heady experience,
very,
the Wallace
very much,
Collection, with all the gilt and the silk. But it's meant to be, and yes, it is a form of escapism, but it's an escapism that's sort of almost honest, in that it's saying this is not quite like anywhere in the real world. It's a fantasy world, but a fantasy world that's based on nature. So almost it's a better fantasy world than a lot of the fantasy worlds that's to do with science fiction or creating this artificial, mechanical view of the world, which modernism tries to create, I think.
And I mean, in terms of, I mean, it's ironic that I work at the the Wallace Collection, because I prefer I'm a realist. I love realist painting, and actually, I'm working on the Ribera exhibition at the moment, who is a proto-realist. He's one of the great hyper-realist artists of the 17th century. How do you react to paintings like Caravaggio and Ribera, for example, where you have that very full-on realism, where anything that's artificial or slightly dreamy is pushed right out? Is that something that you react completely against, or do you actually embrace it?
Well, I'm interested that you say that Ribera is a sort of realist artist, because a lot of people would say, well, I can't look at Ribera, I can't look at the Baroque, it's too much, it's too rich, the sort of colours are too intense, the brush strokes are sort of much too intense, because he's trying to paint in a style which is to do with movement and sensuality more than... They're like, it's the real world, but it's the real world which is very heightened. Especially Ribera, they're so dramatic. I mean, they camp to sort of quite large extent. It's the real world with the volume turned sort of fully up, isn't it? And yes, so he's not an artist which a lot of sort of classicists sort of can look at, so sort of they have a problem with. So I like him very much, but because of that fluidity in the way that he paints and that sense of movement and the sense of Baroque in his work, he's one of the most important artists of that period, definitely.
And do you travel a lot? Do you go to places like Naples and...
the Ribera in Naples, I forget the name of the museum.
The Capo di Monte.
The Capo di Monte, yes.
I mean, do you like blending in with popular culture and watching people live and get your hands dirty in terms of being amongst a sort of society and all that, or do you like to really live in that sort of Capo di Monte world, which is the museum above the city of Naples, where you're in a much more ethereal sort of artistic world? I mean, as an artist, do you like looking at the real life around you?
I like both. Okay. I like being, I mean, it is a sort of wonderful way of looking at it. Sort of you're in Naples, sort of lower down towards the port, and its dirtiness and the graffiti and the sort of noisiness and smelliness of it. And then you go to the top of the hill, to the Capo di Monte Museum, which is quiet in the park.
Nobody there,
and sort of wonderfully calm. But it's the journey, sort of like getting from one to the other, is sort of very telling, because you can't, the museum isn't in isolation, it is surrounded by a sort of city, just as the Wallace Collection is surrounded by a city. And I think it's great having that sense of being able to travel to another world, well, being able to travel to another time as well. As I said, sort of museums and art is a form of time travel. And it's a form of escapism, but only in so much that any sense of storytelling is a form of escapism. If I'm reading about sort of the horrors of the First World War, is that escapism? It's escaping to a sort of period of time, the beginning of the 20th century, but it's not a pleasant form of escape. So you can be taken on a story and told a very different culture in a very different place to your own, but I think you can be told truths which are very relevant to truths that you need to learn for your own life. So what I'm trying to say is escapism is very important. It's like sitting around the campfire and being told stories of how you deal with the real world when you next encounter it. It's as human beings, we like telling each other stories, and we like listening to them, and maybe long continue to do so. The sculptures that I've been making for quite some time started out, I was doing paintings, very flat paintings after Frank Auerbach, and I realised that all of these paintings existed just on the other side of the picture plane. It's as though the surface of the painting is very flat, of my paintings are very flat, and then it's as if you're looking at a world made of paint on the far side of it. As if Frank Auerbach's world has become, it's like a photograph of a world which is where all the figures and the the trees and the sky, everything's made of paint in it. And I suddenly realised, well, that's that side of the picture plane. What about this side of the picture plane? And so the first sculptures I made appeared to be as if the sculptures had literally popped out the surface of the painting and were lying on the floor in front of the paintings. So the first sculptures were literally lying on the floor in front of paintings. The problem then I had is that people would walk in the gallery, sort of look at these things and then kick them, which they're very delicate and they're made of oil paint, so that didn't really work. So then they ended up on plinths, so people wouldn't kick them anymore. And then they ended up under boxes because the first thing people wanted to do was sort of poke them and try and break bits off them, which is fantastic because I want them to be very tactile and I want people to be sort of fascinated with the... I think oil paint's beautiful. I love the sort of translucency it has. It's not like acrylic paints, even though they can do wonderful things as well. It has just a wonderful sense. It has a wonderful smell. The colour in it can be fantastic. And so, yes, these things went under perspex for a long time. For this exhibition, because we had so many frames in the exhibition, and the exhibition had so much to do with framing, that if we were to have the frames and all these sculptures covered, it was just going to seem too closed off. It was going to seem too much about framing and covering, and so we had to take all of the sculptures out of the boxes that we prepared for them, the perspex vitrines, and have them uncovered, which is slightly risky in that it's sort of like people will come along and touch them, but it's nice because it gives them at least a sort of fresh feel. But I see them as being paintings, fundamentally. They're just three-dimensional paintings that I can feel, if it makes sense, the same brain cells working when I'm trying to get the composition of one of the paintings to work by thinking, oh, I need a bit more blue here, I need a darker area here. Maybe if I put a line here, it'll get your eye to move around here. Those same compositional cogs that are working in my head for the paintings are working on the sculptures. It's just that I have to keep moving around the sculptures and making sure they work in 3 dimensions. But again, they're trying to get your eye to flow over them in particular ways and have light areas and dark areas. They're all painted with the one size of brush, which is a little game I play with Frank Auerbach, because he does the same thing. All of his paintings are painted with the same size of brush, which gives a uniformity to them. I haven't come across another artist that does it. There maybe is, but I haven't heard them talk about it. And you can turn the brush on its side slightly to get slightly different brush strokes, but it gives this, when you're dealing with a very complicated, convoluted surface like the sculptures here, it just gives a certain uniformity and it allows your eye to be a little bit more relaxed and looking at it, if that makes sense.
But you're saying you literally are painting, you're painting sculptures?
Yes, everything you see is put on with a paintbrush.
You're not using your hands?
No, it's all put on with a brush. They're all brush strokes. Even what's underneath is brush strokes. There's acrylic underneath, which is acrylic paint, and that's all put on with a brush. So everything is just put together with layer upon layer upon layer of brush strokes. Until finally at some point I realise I can't add any more paint to it, and at which point they're sort of finished. The composition slowly works itself out.
Is there a particular reason why you're using like art history and are you questioning its authenticity, and then are you using that as a platform for the viewers to then take on something? Is there a satire to it?
I think so. I mean, yes, there's the satire in that I am with sort of all of the paintings. I greatly admire the old masters, and with Rembrandt particularly, I love Rembrandt. But putting a red nose on him and giving them this cheesy green and yellow teeth, it's kind of stabbing him in the back a bit as well. So I'm both congratulating, shaking their hands, and sort of like while stabbing them in the back. It's like a father figure in order to say, you know, get out the way, you need to move on. I respect you, you've taught me everything you could, but now get out the way, we need to go somewhere else. There's a bit of that going on. So if I satirise the work that I base the paintings on, it's only insofar that I'm trying to respect them as well. It's a bit of both.
came back to it when you were answering about the sculptures, and it occurred when you talked about preparing for the exhibition, and it's just, you said we. I was wondering who we is.
My husband, Edgar, who's over there, he works with me as well. He doesn't do any of the paintings. I don't have any assistants in the studio. Everything you see, unfortunately, is my own work. But he has it, I mean, he comes in the studio and looks at what I've been doing and go, that's not quite working, and sort of this area up here is sort of like, it's not working, you know, try and put some blue up there maybe. And so, and I have friends that come in the studio as well, and we talk about, you know, what was I trying to do here, and how can I get this painting to work a bit better, and I had this intention, but maybe we could shift it a little bit. So there's a bit of conversation when I make a painting. It's sort of, it's not just me. I'm sort of, I'll steal and borrow and get advice from whoever is near me, because, you know, two minds are better than one. So when I say we, it's even though I do the work myself, it's a bit of a group activity. I can't claim everything just myself. So, yeah.
I remember you mentioning that you were may possibly be working on something very large scale that may well fill a room, and I was just wondering if that's something that's still ongoing and how it's going.
It is, yes, and to that end, we have a space in Marylebone, just about 2 minutes walk from the Wallace Collection, just off Marylebone Lane. And we're in the process of doing building work on it, but it's going to be a small building, about 4,000 square feet, and it will be sort of like, I'm going to make work specifically for this building. And so far, there's going to be probably 3-4 rooms, and there'll be some changing paintings in it, but I'm going to try and make work specifically for this. Because you hang an exhibition like this and it's up for 6 weeks and then it disappears again. And I've enjoyed this process of making this exhibition. It's taken me 2 years to do it. And it's a bit of a pity it just disappears. So I wanted somewhere where I could make something that was going to be a little more permanent. And if I make this, so far the idea is, on one of the floor at least, is to make this whole series of, Abraham Blomart was an artist who was brilliant at drawing trees. And there's various Blomart trees, and I want to try and join them together to make this giant landscape that goes all the way around one room. That's the idea. But so far, I don't know what else is going to happen. But that's what I've mentioned before. This sort of this giant painting which wraps around all of the walls in this space. So.
Thank you so much, Ben Xavier.
Thank you.